All right, we are still on, and we will be on, and we might finish today, but if not, we'll finish tomorrow. Thesis 9, the one that Walther spends 6 lectures on, 4 times what we would expect, a huge chunk of the book on Thesis 9, and somebody read this Thesis 9 again, so we kind of reorient ourselves. Again, page 127, or page 145 in Cooper.
In the 5th place, the word of God is not rightly divided when sinners who have been struck down and terrified by the law are directed not to the word and the sacraments, but to their own prayers and wrestlings with God in order that they may win their way into a state of grace. In other words, when they are told to keep on praying and struggling until they feel that God has received them into grace.
Okay. Obviously, Walther thinks it's a big deal. He says it's a central thesis. He spends lots of time on it. And we've already said, I think, one reason that Walther would see this as huge, and that is that this really is kind of the watershed or the divide of Lutheran theology from those who would be closest to us, really. Because, of course, the Reformed would all say, yes, you're saved by grace through faith alone, yet they'd all say that. But then, ultimately, the direction for the assurance of salvation still often winds up being something inside ourselves. And these are kind of pietistic examples, the prayers, wrestlings, you'll pick that up later, feelings. Other things that other Reformed branches might work with would be like your decision for Christ, where you're always asking yourself, how sincere was my decision? Other things that Reform might direct us to. If you were a real 5-point Calvinist and really believe in double predestination, what other sorts of things do you sometimes look at for assurance?
The fruits.
Yes, right. And what kinds of fruits?
The one that John writes in his letter.
Okay, yeah. So
brotherly love.
Yeah, exactly. The fruits of our faith, us doing those things. Yeah, that exactly. And of course, that's a big challenge when you see yourself sinning. Also, though, you know what else? Sometimes some double predestinarians will point to. It's a different kind of fruit. It's not that kind of fruit. What else? What were you going to say, Tobias?
The same thing.
Same thing. Yeah. To see if God is blessing you.
Oh, really?
Yes. Yeah, that would be a fruit also. Now that's not a biblical fruit, it's not a fruit of faith at all. But look and see, if you are among the elect, well, how do you know that? Or double predestination, are you among the elect? Well, kind of look and see, how's it going these days? And see if God is blessing you well. Well, it's pretty obvious that all of these have major flaws. Fruits, as in fruits of faith, as in good works, as in love, that, of course, we're not always sure about at all, because we know how badly we do on that score sometimes. Our decision, that's always where you're asking, was I really sincere back when that moment came? And of course, how God's blessing you, boy, you lost your job. Not quite sure you're among the elect, my friend. That's a horrible kind of thing. So, I think one reason that Walther says this is such a big deal is because this is where Lutheran theology really changes. It is really 180 degrees different from even those Christians who are pretty close to us. Our assurance of salvation completely outside ourselves and the means of grace. But there's also, I think, another reason Walther says this is such a big deal is because of his personal experience. And what's his story on that?
Oh, yeah. When he was a youth and went to college, he had a group of pietistic.
Exactly. You'll tell us the story. Turn to page, especially 142 and following, but it kind of starts a little bit on 140 or 160, and then on the 161, 162 in Cooper. Okay, now tell us.
Yeah. So he's a young man, and he joins a group, and then they talk about Christianity, and then he somehow a pietist comes in and says, "You're not really saved," because there's levels to it, and then it destroys every kind of salvation or assurance.
Assurance, exactly.
Walther, and it's only later when he finds out that it's not really about the feelings.
Right, exactly. Yep, that's right. Anybody want that? Exactly correct. Yep. The thing begins there on page 140, where the guy that Stephen refers to is a disciple of John Philip Fresenius. This is on page 140. Died in 1705, or born in 1705, died in 1761, and he was highly regarded and so on. And he wrote a book on confession and communion, and teaching people how they can really come to faith, how they can really be converted. Fresenius, a huge pietist. Okay, Walther was born in a nominally Lutheran family, baptized as an infant, so we have every confidence that he was a believer as an infant. But remember, we said his father, who's a pastor, was inclined how? Rationalist, yeah. His father was quite given over to rationalism, and as the church was. And so Walther, kind of looking back, says that, in those years, from undoubtedly being a believer in infant baptism through the young adult years, not all that sure of faith as well, because the the rationalist influences were very strong. But he gets to college, and he and his brother get in with this group of fellow students who are the conservatives. They're not the rationalists. They believe the Bible. They believe the miracles. And Walther's really very excited about this until this gent comes along. His name is not given. Anybody know what his name was? His name was Kuhn. Okay. And what was Kuhn's status? Walther kind of mentions that a little bit. There's more detail than Walther gives you there. He says on page 142, this candidate came to us. Okay? And what was that candidate's situation? What does it mean by candidate there?
Finished university.
Exactly. Yes, right. He finished the theological training to become a pastor, but he was a conservative. That means he believed the miracles and so on, which means he wasn't a rationalist, and the church in Germany was so given over to rationalism that it wasn't likely he was ever going to get a call. So instead, I suppose with good intentions, but you figure there's probably a little bit of selfishness involved, he kind of attaches himself to these boys and says, well, if I can't get a call to a real congregation that pays, at least I'll shepherd these poor young lads who need help. And as Walther says, he was more pietistic than Fresenius. So very, very rigid about this. And exactly as Stephen said, he began to tell them, you guys aren't really converted. You're not really saved because you haven't gone through enough struggles, wrestlings, prayers, and all that. And the more he spoke to them, the more Walther despaired of being a believer. He decided, I'm not a believer after all, and I'm on my way to hell. What changed that for Walther? This is another person who was not named.
Got a letter.
Right. First he sent a letter. This is the bottom of 142. I heard of a man who was reported to be a real spiritual physician. I wrote to him with the thoughts in my mind. And Walther says there what his expectation was from the letter. What do you think might come out of that letter?
Comfort, or...
Well, he was hoping there would be comfort, but in fact, he said to himself, he wanted comfort, but...
He would then cast it away.
Right. He was so convinced that he was not a fit candidate for the gospel yet, that if this letter comes back and gives me grace, gives me comfort, I will throw it away. Because I know it doesn't apply to me. And later on, Walther will talk explicitly about the pietists on this one, where the big pietistic error was to say that you could be awakened but not converted, and wouldn't give you the gospel for a long time after that. they withhold the gospel from you until some later time. That you, the gospel, of course, was true, they'd say, but you're not allowed to believe it yet. Terrible kind of idea. And that's where Walther thought he was. It's so ironic. Well, Jesus died on the cross for the sins of the whole world, but I'm not allowed to believe that yet. And so, if that letter tells me that, I'll throw it away. However, when the letter came, he read it, and it really did melt his resistance. The law had done its work. He was terrified, like crazy. He thought he was going to hell. He just didn't think the gospel could be relevant for him. But when he read the gospel in the letter, it was so beautiful that it really did bring him once again to an assurance of salvation. Do you know Walther does not give us here who the letter was written by. Do you know who it was? Want to guess? You got the name yesterday.
Stefan.
Martin
really?
Stefan.
That guy?
It was that guy. Yeah, Stefan. Martin Stefan. Yep. He wrote the letter that brought Walther back to an assurance of his salvation. Yep, that's right. And that then, of course, is what resulted in Walther and his brother becoming disciples of Stefan and eventually following Stefan to America. So this, and of course, as I said, Stefan then was removed for adultery, and that's what led to the Altenburg debates and Walther's accession to being the leader of the emigrants to America. But at this point, Stefan was the hero, which is kind of ironic and amazing. If not for Martin Stefan, for all of the stuff that went badly later, one would say, humanly speaking, there would never have been a Missouri Synod. Actually, so it would never have been a C.F.W.Walther's proper distinction from law and gospel. So that's quite significant, and this means for this reason also, this thesis is really huge to Walther. Really, personally, very, very big. He knows personally what a big difference it makes whether your focus for the assurance of salvation is on yourself or whether it's on Christ. Not Kuhn and Stefan, but Kuhn was teaching what Stefan taught him. Yeah. So it's a remarkable story, actually. In church history in our class, in our seminary, you learn all that because that's the history of our synod, actually. A very, very big element there. For that reason, then, again, I think this is a huge thesis for Walther, just a tremendously significant element. Much goes on from there in the 9th lecture, or the 9th thesis. Skip up to page 165 now, or I think 188 in Cooper. You guys all know page 165, the Marburg colloquy. What happened in the colloquy at Marburg in 1529? What happened there?
So Luther was in, what do we call it? He was in prison or doing his thing, or wasn't it?
Luther was.
Yeah.
He's back for the war.
So
yeah, he's back. Yeah, he's been back for about 8 years now. Yeah. But is that not a familiar story? Maybe it's not.
He meets with Zwingli. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
I know.
Right, exactly. Zwingli and his companions, Luther and his companions, get together at Marburg, and they address 15 subjects of 15 points of theology. They reach agreement on 14 and part of the 15th one, right? And what's the one point that doesn't? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there it is. Yeah. This is the one where Luther at the beginning writes "is," "est," right? Covers it up, and eventually gets to the point of discussion, the Lord's Supper. And Zwingli is, of course, adamant that is "est" only means represents, and Luther says no, it is. And that seemed like a small thing to an outsider. To Luther, it was very big. Zwingli wanted to be a small thing. In fact, Zwingli, really pleaded with Luther to, can't we reach agreement? They shook hands and all went on. But then afterward, Zwingli continued with some of his writing, and Luther wrote back and said, that's a total sham.
And Luther called him a non-Christian because of his non-belief in the presence of Christ.
Right. And those are strong words. The words that Walther cites from Luther on the bottom of 165, he says, yours is a different spirit from ours.
Wow.
So it was not at all, not a small thing at all. It was a very, very big thing.
But would you go as far as Luther did?
I don't think so that he was an unbeliever. I don't think so. But the question on this kind of thing, this is, man, we are almost there. Oh yeah. We're almost 5 o'clock. I thought we were only 4 o'clock. Maybe we'll put pretty soon. But we'll continue thesis 9 afterwards. The question is, at what point does someone who is heterodox become a hardened heretic? Right? Because clearly Zwingli was heterodox. Okay, his teaching on the Lord's Supper was false. It was not orthodox. Now he didn't think so. He thought he was the orthodox one. Of course, that's always the way it is. If he, my Baptist friends that I went to study with, those good Kent and Howell and Dr. Hefferman I talked about, they were heterodox, but I never thought they were hardened heretics. I still always think it was a simplicity of mind thing. And where Zwingli was on that, I certainly don't know. I don't know that we can know. I don't know that Luther could really know. Luther was right there with him. And maybe Luther was convinced that it was a willful, impenitent, false teaching. But I can't see that from where I am.
I just remember reading that Luther, one of the arguments of calling Zwingli a non-Christian because of that he didn't believe that Christ is present when we go to the Last Supper. It's, as I remember it, Luther states that Zwingli didn't believe that Christ is still living, because if he can't be present as he teaches us in the Bible, I'm pretty sure that was one of the arguments Luther had.
Yeah, I don't know that. I've never heard that. Of course, the basic Reformed position is that Christ's body is in heaven, right, and his soul is here. So the misunderstanding of the communication of attributes, that's obviously the big issue, and that's why you'd say in a very real sense it's a different Christ. One thing that in the dialogue at Marburg was when Zwingli asked Luther, so Dr. Luther, just what Christ do you worship? And Luther said, the one that nursed at Mary's breast, none other than the one that nursed at Mary's breast, and I want no other. So in other words, he was saying that Christ is the human God-man always. And Zwingli wouldn't say that, because he would say the divine Christ and the human Christ, shared occupied the same space, or whatever, I say it for a while. And the analogy often is like two boards glued together, right? But now separated. And that is a totally different understanding of Christ than the communication of attributes, where God and man are, all the divine attributes are really fully received in the human Christ. So that's different, but that to me doesn't make it impossible for what we call simplicity of mind, because that's a very sophisticated concept to believe and to demonstrate from Scripture. So yeah, I don't know. So I've never said it wasn't living anymore. I don't know. But,
no, yeah, maybe I'm getting it wrong, but I just looked it up, and I had read it in Martin Luther's Vom Abendmahl Christi Bekenntnis.
Yeah.
So it was an English or English translation I read, but
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it's there.
Okay, that may be. And I'd say undoubtedly that would be Luther's conclusion about the situation. Now Luther's conclusion doesn't determine whether swimming is in heaven or hell.
Oh, no.
You know? And I sure don't know. I would never have said that, and I didn't know that accusation by Luther. I really don't know the case. But clearly, what we've got then is a concern that we really have a significantly different theology. And where it comes down, ultimately, really is this thesis 9, whether our assurance is in ourselves or outside ourselves. Now, again, I didn't realize it was 5 o'clock now. So I think we'll stop at this point. But I will leave you with the query. If you want to think about it or look at it again tonight at all, to think about what Walther says about, in this case, absolution. Okay? Because when we talk about the means of grace, that's one. We really spend significant time on absolution as one of the places we should look for the assurance rather than our prayers wrestlings with God. Okay? We shall stop at this point.